They mocked her torn jacket, a faded field coat with a clumsy black stitch running up the left sleeve. It was an ugly, obvious repair, a scar of thread on worn fabric. To the young soldiers of Forward Operating Base Kestrel, it was a sign that the woman wearing it was either careless or forgotten, a piece of logistical driftwood washed up on their remote, dusty shore. But a turning point was coming, a moment when the storm would hit and an admiral would see not the tear, but the secret hidden beneath it. Alara Vance stepped off the transport shuttle into a blast of superheated air. The sun beat down on the Duracrete landing pad, and the horizon shimmered with heat. FOB Kestrel was a lonely speck of order in a vast expanse of ochre desert, a ring of prefabricated buildings and chain-link fences holding back an ocean of sand. Her transfer orders had been lean on detail, assigning her to the quartermaster's depot, a desk job, a glorified stock-taking position after a career spent in the shadows. Two soldiers, barely out of their teens, were leaning against a stack of supply crates, trying to look busy. One wore corporal stripes, the other was a private first class. "Check out the new transfer." The private, O'Connell, muttered to his companion, Corporal Lee. "Looks like they raided a surplus store." Lee snorted, his eyes fixed on the jagged black stitching on Alara's jacket. "Command must be scraping the bottom of the barrel. She's probably been filing forms since the last war." Alara heard them. The desert wind carried their words as clearly as if they'd been whispered in her ear. She didn't react. Her face, etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and harsh suns rather than age, remained a neutral mask. Her gaze swept past them, absorbing the architecture of the base. She noted the placement of the watchtowers, the interlocking fields of fire from the perimeter gun emplacements. She saw the main communications array on the central command building, its dish tracking a satellite in low orbit. Her eyes followed the power conduits snaking from the generators to the various sectors of the base. She saw the patterns in the dust devils that spun across the plain, cataloging the prevailing wind direction. She registered a section of razor wire near the western gate that sagged slightly, creating a potential ingress point just below the sweep of a surveillance camera. It was all automatic, a process of threat assessment so deeply ingrained it was like breathing. To her, a base was not a place of safety. It was a collection of vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. She was here to sort crates, but the instincts of her former life refused to be shelved so easily. The torn jacket felt heavy on her shoulders, not from wear, but from the weight of the secrets it helped her keep. Her reporting to the base commander was an exercise in bureaucratic condescension. Colonel Marcus Thorne was a man who lived by the book. His uniform was immaculate, the creases in his trousers sharp enough to cut paper. His office was a sterile environment of polished metal and spotless glass, a testament to his obsession with order. He held Alara's transfer file between two fingers as if it were contaminated. "Sergeant Alara Vance," he said, his voice flat. He didn't invite her to sit. He scanned the digital file, his brow furrowed. "The records are unusually sparse. Logistics specialist. Served at Citadel Station, then a long stint on medical leave. Now you're here." He looked up, and his gaze was like a physical probe, searching for weakness. His eyes stopped on her jacket. "We have standards of dress and bearing at FOB Kestrel, Sergeant. That garment is non-regulation." "It's functional, sir," Alara replied, her voice even. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She had faced down interrogators with more menace in their little fingers than this colonel had in his entire body. His disapproval was a minor atmospheric disturbance. Nothing more. "Functionality does not supersede protocol," Thorne countered, his tone clipped. "Your role here is simple. You will report to Master Sergeant Petrova at the supply depot. You will inventory incoming shipments and manage requisitions. You are, for all intents and purposes, a clerk. Is that understood?" "Understood, sir. This is a frontline outpost, Vance, not a retirement home. We don't have room for personnel who can't pull their weight or follow basic directives. Get a new jacket from supply, keep your head down and stay out of the way," He made a dismissive gesture with his hand, already turning his attention back to his terminal. He had categorized her, filed her away as a piece of administrative deadwood, another body to fill a slot on a roster. Alara gave a crisp nod. Yes, sir. She turned and walked out of the office, her footsteps silent on the polished floor. Thorne didn't watch her go. In his mind, she had already disappeared. Alara's own mind was a placid lake. This was part of the process. To become a ghost again, she first had to be utterly invisible. The colonel's dismissal was not an insult. It was a gift. It gave her the one thing she needed most, the freedom of being underestimated. As she walked toward the sprawling warehouse that served as the supply depot, she allowed a small, cold part of her to feel a sliver of pity for him. He saw a worn jacket and a thin file. He had no idea what kind of storm was gathering just over the horizon, and he had no idea that the person he had just dismissed was the only one on the entire base who knew how to survive it. The supply depot was a vast, cavernous space filled with the scent of ozone, packing grease, and recycled air. Crates were stacked 30 feet high in dizzying columns, their contents indicated by blinking digital manifests. Automated forklifts hummed along designated paths, their robotic arms moving with tireless precision. Alara's new supervisor, Master Sergeant Petrova, was a stout woman with a permanently sour expression who assigned her a workstation and a scanner gun with minimal instruction. The work was exactly as Colonel Thorne had described, mind-numbingly simple. Scan the crate. Verify the contents against the manifest. Route it to the correct bay. Repeat. For anyone else, it would have been a descent into crushing boredom. For Alara, it was an opportunity. The depot was the heart of the base, the nexus through which every piece of equipment, every weapon, every medical kit, every ration pack flowed. By studying the manifests, she learned the base's operational capacity. She saw they were overstocked on standard ammunition but dangerously low on plasma cells for the heavy defense turrets. She noted the requisition orders for replacement parts for the atmospheric scrubbers, parts which were 3 weeks overdue. She learned the base's weaknesses not by looking at a tactical map, but by reading its shopping list. While her hands were busy, her mind was free to roam. She used the monotonous hours to build a complete sensory map of FOB Kestrel. She didn't just know the official patrol routes. She learned the unofficial shortcut soldiers took between barracks. She learned the timing of the guard rotations at the perimeter towers down to the second. She observed the subtle flicker in the lights that occurred every time the main reactor shifted its power load. She listened to the chatter over the open comm channels, filtering out the idle gossip to catch snippets of technical data. She continued to observe Corporal Lee and PFC O'Connell, who also worked shifts in the depot. Lee was a savant with hardware, capable of field stripping and reassembling a comms unit in minutes, but he crumbled under pressure, his nimble fingers turning to clumsy thumbs when things went wrong. O'Connell was a bull, strong, determined, and fiercely loyal to his squadmates, but his first instinct was always to charge forward, a trait that could get people killed. She saw them not as the boys who had mocked her jacket, but as assets with specific strengths and exploitable weaknesses. Her focus often drifted to the base's critical infrastructure. From a high window in the depot, she could see the central command building. Her eyes traced the heavily shielded conduits leading to the comms array. Then she looked beyond, to the exposed backup generator situated 50 meters away from the main building. Its fuel lines were above ground, a glaring design flaw. An attacker wouldn't need to destroy the generator itself, just sever the lines. From her vantage point, she also had a clear view of the long-range sensor suite on the rocky ridge that overlooked the base from the north. She watched the technicians perform their daily diagnostics, and she noticed how local magnetic interference from mineral deposits in the ridge caused momentary data lags at specific times of day. An enemy with the right intelligence could use those lags as a window. These were not idle observations. They were data points, filed away in the vast, silent archive of her mind. This place, so confident in its fences and guns, was a house of cards. Alara just kept scanning boxes, her expression unreadable, waiting for the wind to blow. The wind began as a whisper, a faint grit against the metal walls of the depot. Within minutes, it was a howl. A sandstorm, born in the deep desert, slammed into FOB Kestrel with the force of a physical blow. The sky turned a churning, violent shade of brown-black. Visibility dropped to zero. The fine, abrasive dust worked its way through every seal and vent, a suffocating presence that clogged machinery and lungs alike. This was no ordinary weather event. It carried an electrical charge that made hair stand on end and caused electronics to fizz and short out. Then the lights flickered and died. The hum of the base's power grid vanished, replaced by the shrieking of the wind and the groan of stressed metal. The emergency lights, powered by local batteries, kicked in, casting long, eerie shadows through the swirling dust inside the buildings. The entire base was plunged into a state of primal fear. In the command and information center, chaos reigned. Colonel Thorne stood before the main tactical display, which was now a screen of useless, flickering static. "Report!" he yelled, his voice strained. "What's our status?" Corporal Lee, his face pale in the red glow of the emergency lighting, frantically worked his console. "Main power is gone, sir." The storms created a massive electromagnetic pulse. It's fried the primary grid. All external comms are down. The long-range sensors on the ridge are completely offline. "We're blind, sir. Totally blind. Switch to the backup generator. Get me a link to Sector Command." Thorne snapped. "The backup generator isn't responding, and I can't raise anyone." Lee's voice was rising in pitch, bordering on panic. "The EM field is too dense. It's like a wall. No signal can get through." On the perimeter, the situation was worse. Soldiers huddled behind barricades, unable to see more than a few feet into the maelstrom. PFC O'Connell was with his squad near the western gate, trying to maintain some semblance of a defensive line. "Stay tight," he shouted over the wind, his words snatched away. "Report any contacts." But there was nothing to report. There was only the storm, a suffocating, disorienting entity that had swallowed them whole. The rigid order of the base had disintegrated in moments. The soldiers were isolated, deaf, and blind. Panic was a contagion, spreading faster than the dust. Thorne's authority, built on protocol and control, was useless against an enemy he couldn't see or speak to. He was a king in a castle whose walls had just vanished. The supply depot, with its high, broad roof, took the brunt of the storm's fury. The massive structure groaned and shuddered as the wind hammered against it. Then, with a scream of tearing metal, a section of the corrugated roof directly above Bay 7 ripped away. A heavy support beam, twisted and torn from its mooring, crashed down onto the floor below. A young private, who had been securing a pallet of medical supplies, screamed. A sharp cry of pain cut short as the beam pinned his leg against a crate. Dust and debris rained down. For a moment, everyone froze. Lee, who had been trying to rig a makeshift comms booster nearby, stared in horror. O'Connell, having just entered the depot to look for emergency flares, swore and started to run toward the wreckage without a plan. Alara moved. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. The chaos seemed to slow down around her, each detail becoming sharp and clear. She grabbed a discarded length of steel pipe from a scrap heap. "O'Connell!" Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the din with an unnatural clarity. It was the voice of pure command. "Here. Now!" O'Connell stopped, his impulsive charge halted by the sheer authority in her tone. He ran to her side. She pointed with the pipe. "The beam is resting on this structural joint. It's a pivot point. We use leverage, not brute force." She wedged the end of the pipe under the heavy beam. "Place your hands here. When I say lift, you push up. Do not jerk it. A steady, controlled motion." He nodded, his eyes wide. He did as he was told, his muscles straining against the weight. "Now," Alara said calmly. Together they lifted. The massive beam shifted, rising just enough. Lee, shaking himself from his stupor, scrambled forward and dragged the injured private clear. Alara was instantly at the private's side. Her fingers found his femoral artery, checking for a pulse, her eyes scanning the injury. No arterial bleeding, she announced. The bone is likely fractured. We need to immobilize it before we move him. Without waiting for a response, she broke open a nearby crate containing uniform supplies. She pulled out 2 rigid composite plates from inside new body armor vests and a roll of nylon webbing. In less than 30 seconds, she had fashioned a professional, effective splint, securing the private's leg with practiced efficiency. She looked up at Lee, who was still staring at her. "The comms," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "The standard military frequencies are saturated by the storm's electromagnetism. It's useless." "But there's nothing else," Lee stammered. "Every channel is dead." "Not every channel," Alara corrected him. "Switch your transceiver to the subharmonic band. Channel 79er. It's an old, deprecated frequency band used for deep space telemetry. The storm's interference is concentrated in the higher spectrums. This one will be clearer. Aim a low-gain, directional broadcast at the old civilian relay tower 3 clicks east of here. It's shielded from the worst of the storm by the Crimson Rock Formation." Lee looked at her, baffled. That channel is obsolete. It's not even in the standard tactical manual." Alara's gaze was like ice. "Do it." The shift in the CIC was palpable. Corporal Lee, his hands flying across the auxiliary console with a newfound purpose, bypassed the standard protocols. He keyed in the subharmonic frequency Alara had given him. For a few agonizing seconds, there was only static. Then a faint crackle. He fine-tuned the directional antenna, aiming it blindly toward the coordinates she had specified. The crackle resolved into a voice, faint but clear. "Repeat, this is Outpost Sierra. We are cut off. Is anyone receiving?" It was one of their own patrol units, stranded on the other side of the ridge. Colonel Thorne, who had been pacing like a caged animal, froze. He stared at the comms unit as if it were a miracle. "Who is that? How did you get that signal?" Lee didn't take his eyes off the console. His voice filled with a dawning awe. "It was Sergeant Vance, sir. She told me which frequency to use. She knew the tower on the ridge would be shielded." Thorne turned to the security monitor that showed a grainy, emergency power feed from the supply depot. On the screen, Alara was calmly organizing a small group of soldiers, directing them to secure loose equipment and set up a makeshift triage center. There was no panic in her movements, only a serene, methodical competence. She moved like a wolf among startled sheep. Just then, the comms from Outpost Sierra crackled again, this time with urgency. "CIC, be advised. We have anomalous energy readings on the edge of the storm front. Multiple signatures, moving in coordinated patterns. It's not just a storm, sir. It's cover. I repeat, this is cover for an inbound attack." The revelation hit Thorne like a physical blow. They hadn't been fighting the weather. They had been played. The enemy had used the storm's unique properties to blind them, and they were walking right into a trap. And the only reason they knew was because the logistics clerk in the torn jacket had somehow known about an obsolete frequency and the topographical shielding of a rock formation 3 kilometers away. Thorne stared at Alara's image on the screen. The dismissive arrogance he had felt in his office evaporated, replaced by a cold, unsettling curiosity. He had misjudged her. He had misjudged her profoundly. The question was no longer what she was doing at his base, but who she was. He had a terrifying premonition that the answer would rewrite everything he thought he knew about the soldier he'd dismissed as a clerk. His world, so carefully ordered, was beginning to fracture. Just as the realization of the attack solidified, a series of muffled explosions rocked the base from the outside. The emergency lights in the CIC flickered violently, then dimmed to a barely perceptible glow. On a secondary status board, a dozen red icons flashed at once. "Sir!" an engineer shouted. "Multiple impacts confirmed on the auxiliary generator housing. The fuel lines are severed. We've lost all connection to it. Battery power status." Thorne roared. "Critically low. We have 12 minutes, maybe less, before the entire base goes dark. No lights, no internal comms, no automated defenses. The news landed like a death sentence. Without power, the sophisticated defense turrets that lined the perimeter were just useless lumps of metal. They would be slaughtered. Thorne's mind raced, cycling through standard emergency protocols, but none applied. The storm was too thick for an EVA repair crew to navigate safely, and even if they could, the enemy was clearly concentrating their fire on that exact location. It was a kill zone. Sending his men out there would be suicide. His eyes, now wide with desperation, flicked back to the monitor showing the supply depot. He saw Elara, her face calm amidst the rising panic of the soldiers around her. She was the one who had given them back their ears. Maybe she could give them back their power. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one he had. He stabbed the button for the depot's internal comm, which was still running on a local battery. Vance. My office. Now, the order was not a request. It was a plea. Less than a minute later, Elara appeared at the door of the CIC. The wind howled in the corridor behind her, whipping strands of hair across her face. She stepped inside, and the door hissed shut, muffling the storm's roar. She looked at Thorne, her expression unreadable. All pretense of superiority was gone from the colonel's face. He was just a commander on the verge of losing his command. He pointed a trembling finger at the main tactical map, now a dim schematic lit by a single emergency lamp. The auxiliary generator. They've cut the fuel lines. My engineers say it's impossible to reach. The enemy is dug in, waiting for us. We have, he glanced at the ticking clock on the wall, 11 minutes of power left. Then we're dead in the water. Tell me what you see. He wasn't asking for a regulation answer. He was asking for a miracle. Elara's eyes scanned the map for no more than 3 seconds. Her gaze was intense, analytical. She wasn't looking at the symbols on the map. She was looking through them, accessing the three-dimensional model she had built in her own mind. Sending a repair team over the surface is a tactical error, she stated, her voice flat and certain. It's what they expect. It's a funnel. You'll lose the entire team, and you won't get the generator online. She reached out and tapped a seemingly blank area on the map, a space between the depot and the generator housing. There is a subterranean maintenance conduit here, she said. It runs from the depot's sub-level 2 drainage system to an access point no more than 20 meters from the generator's primary fuel pump. The schematics are 100 years old. It's not on any modern base plan. It's narrow, filled with debris, but it's navigable for 1, maybe 2 people. Thorne stared at the spot she had indicated. How could you possibly know that? I read the original colonial survey plans for this region. They're in the base archives, misfiled under geological surveys, she said without a hint of pride. It was simply a fact. Thorne was speechless. He, the commander, had never even thought to look. My people, they don't know those tunnels. They wouldn't know how to navigate them. Elara met his gaze. I do. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the room. Give me O'Connell. He's strong and he follows orders. And give me a standard field engineering kit. We can bypass the severed line and patch directly into the reserve tank. We can have the generator running in 10 minutes. Thorne stared at her, at this quiet, unassuming woman in a tattered jacket who was now casually dismantling his entire understanding of his own base. He had no other options. The clock was ticking. The survival of everyone at FOB Kestrel rested on whether he could trust this ghost who had appeared in his supply depot. Go, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Take whatever you need. Just get it done. The descent into the conduit was a descent into another world. Elara used a crowbar to pry open a rusted, forgotten access hatch in the floor of the depot's sublevel, revealing a dark, narrow shaft. A wave of stale, cold air washed over them. Stay close, she told O'Connell, who was clutching a heavy engineering kit and looking nervously into the abyss. Watch your footing. Use your helmet lamp, but keep the beam low. She swung herself into the darkness with the ease of a practiced spelunker. O'Connell followed, his heavy boots clanging on the iron rungs of the ladder. The tunnel at the bottom was barely shoulder width, the air thick with the smell of rust and decay. Rats skittered away from their lights. They moved in silence, Alara in the lead. She moved with an eerie grace, her feet finding purchase on the slick, uneven floor without a sound. She seemed to know every turn, every dip in the floor before her light even touched it. O'Connell, stumbling behind her, felt a growing sense of awe. This was not a logistics clerk. This was something else entirely. The sounds of the battle above were a distant, muffled drumming, a constant reminder of the clock ticking away their lives. After what felt like an eternity, Alara stopped. "We're here," she whispered. She pointed to a small, grated vent just above their heads. Through it, they could see the dark, angular shape of the generator housing, silhouetted by the flashes of distant weapons fire. The air vibrated with the crackle of plasma bolts impacting nearby. "They have the main access door covered," Alara said, her voice a low murmur. "They'll have motion sensors and thermal scanners deployed." O'Connell listened carefully. She handed him 3 small, adhesive devices from her pocket. "These are sonic emitters. On my signal, you will throw one to the far left of the generator, one to the far right, and one directly over it. They will create false audio and sensor signatures for exactly 90 seconds. It will draw their fire and blind their sensors. That's our window. While they're distracted, I'll get to the pump. Understand?" O'Connell nodded, his throat dry. "Understood. Now," Alara commanded. O'Connell scrambled up a small ledge and, with surprising accuracy, hurled the emitters. Immediately, the area was filled with the sound of phantom footsteps and weapons chatter. The enemy, confused, opened fire on the ghost signals, unleashing a torrent of plasma that lit up the night. As the torrent began, Alara moved. She burst from the conduit exit, a gray shadow in the swirling dust and chaos. She moved low and fast, a fluid, economical sprint that seemed to defy the laws of physics. She reached the generator's fuel control panel just as a stray plasma bolt impacted the wall behind her. The heat was intense, and a piece of jagged, superheated shrapnel flew past her, catching the sleeve of her worn jacket. The crude black stitching, already weakened by age, ripped open. The tear ran from her shoulder to her elbow, and the fabric peeled back. Underneath, exposed to the strobing light of the battle, was a small, circular patch that had been deliberately hidden. It was sewn directly onto the layer of clothing beneath her jacket. The patch was stark black, and at its center was the faded, silver-embroidered silhouette of a ghost. Back in the CIC, the world was ending. The batteries were about to die. Just then, a high-priority, heavily encrypted data burst finally punched through the storm's interference. It was from Fleet Command, flagged with the highest urgency. An aide, his hands shaking, decrypted it. "Sir, it's from Admiral Rostova. She's rerouting her flagship to our position. She's conducting an unscheduled inspection." The news was baffling, but it was overshadowed by the secondary file attached to the message. A security clearance key, personally authorized by the Admiral, had just desealed a classified personnel file. "Sir, you need to see this," the aide whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. He projected the file onto the main screen. The name at the top was Alara Vance. Most of the service history was just solid black bars of redaction. But 2 things were clear. Her last assigned unit, Special Operations Task Force 0, and her call sign Spectre. Thorne stared at the screen, the name echoing in his memory. Task Force 0. They weren't real. They were a myth, a ghost story told by veteran Marines to scare recruits. An ultra-elite, deep-cover unit that handled threats so sensitive their existence was officially denied. They were assassins, saboteurs, and spies of the highest caliber, deployed and then erased. Their symbol, according to the legends, was a black patch with a silver ghost. The unit had been officially disbanded 5 years ago, its members either dead or vanished. Thorne's head snapped from the file on the screen to the security feed. The camera, running on its last dregs of power, was zoomed in on Alara as she worked furiously at the fuel pump, sparks flying from her tool. And there, on her torn sleeve, illuminated in the hellish light of the battle, was the patch. the silver ghost, the logistics clerk, the washed-up soldier, Spectre. It all crashed down on Colonel Thorne with the force of a physical impact. He hadn't just underestimated a soldier. He had dismissed a living legend. With a final, decisive twist of her wrench, Alara locked the bypass valve into place. She slammed her hand down on the manual ignition switch for the reserve pump. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, guttural roar, the auxiliary generator coughed to life. Power surged through the base's grid. The dim emergency lights in the CIC blazed into full white brilliance. Across the base, the automated defense turrets, now fully powered, swiveled to acquire targets. A storm of disciplined, coordinated fire erupted along the perimeter, cutting through the disorganized enemy ranks with brutal efficiency. The tide of the battle didn't just turn. It broke like a dam. Alara and O'Connell slipped back through the tunnels, the sounds of the enemy's panicked retreat echoing behind them. The storm, as if its purpose had been served, began to recede, its furious howl softening to a mournful sigh. By the time they reached the supply depot, the first hints of dawn were breaking through the clouds. They walked toward the CIC. Soldiers they passed stopped what they were doing and stared. News traveled fast in a place like this, and the story of the quiet logistics clerk who had single-handedly saved the base was spreading like wildfire. They saw the torn jacket, the grease-smeared face, and for the first time, they saw the warrior beneath. When Alara stepped into the CIC, the buzzing hub of activity fell into an immediate, profound silence. Every officer, every technician, every analyst turned to face her. They had all seen the file. They had all watched the security feeds. They saw the woman who had walked into hell for them. The quiet mockery that had greeted her arrival was gone, replaced by a deep, unshakable awe. Colonel Thorne, his face a mask of humility, stood from his command chair. He walked across the room, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence, and stopped directly in front of her. He didn't speak. His eyes dropped to her left arm, to the ripped sleeve and the revealed Spectre patch. Then he looked her in the eye. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand to his brow in a formal salute. It was not the salute a colonel gives a subordinate. It was the salute a soldier gives to a hero, an acknowledgement of a prowess and courage that transcended rank. One by one, like a ripple spreading through the room, every other person in uniform followed his lead. Lee, the tech she had guided, snapped to attention, his salute crisp. The senior NCOs, battle-hardened veterans who had seen it all, saluted her. O'Connell, standing beside her, straightened his back and raised his hand, his eyes shining with a mixture of fear, pride, and utter reverence for the woman he had followed into the dark. At that precise moment, the main doors to the CIC hissed open. Admiral Eva Rostova swept in, flanked by two stern-faced aides. She was a tall, imposing woman whose reputation preceded her. She took in the extraordinary scene in a single glance. Her entire command staff, including the base commander, at full salute to a non-commissioned officer in a ripped and dirty field jacket. Her sharp eyes scanned the room and then locked onto Alara. The rest of the world seemed to fall away. Admiral Rostova walked through the silent, saluting ranks, her boots making no sound. She stopped less than a foot from Alara, her gaze unwavering. "Spectre," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of years and the gravity of command. It was not a question. It was a recognition. Alara, who had stood impassively through the salutes, finally met the Admiral's gaze. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Admiral." Rostova's eyes flicked down to the torn sleeve, to the faded silver ghost. A complex emotion played across her face. A shadow of regret, a glint of shared history, a deep, weary understanding. "It seems your retirement is as eventful as your service," she said dryly. She then turned her head slightly to address the still saluting Colonel Thorne. "Colonel, it appears you've had Sergeant Major Vance's expertise at your disposal. I trust you've made good use of it." The words hung in the air. Sergeant Major. It was a rank Alara had held in the shadows, a rank that had been erased from her file along with everything else. Rostova had just restored it with a single sentence. Thorn, his face flushing with a mixture of shame and gratitude, could only nod. Yes, Admiral. We have. Rostova turned back to Alara. The formal mask of the Admiral softened for a fraction of a second, revealing the woman who had once sent Spectre on impossible missions. We need to talk, she said, her voice dropping lower. She gestured with her head toward her private shuttle. Walk with me. Alara fell into step beside her. As they walked out of the CIC, the assembled officers slowly lowered their arms, their eyes following the two women. They no longer saw a logistics clerk. They saw a living piece of history walking beside the highest authority in the fleet. The torn jacket, once a symbol of neglect, was now a badge of honor, a testament to the hidden strength it had concealed. The final image was of Alara and the Admiral crossing the Duracrete landing pad. The storm had completely broken. The rising sun cast long shadows behind them, and a ray of light caught the silver thread of the ghost on Alara's sleeve, making it shine with a pale, ethereal light. Her posture was the same as it had been when she arrived, straight-backed, disciplined, radiating a quiet dignity. She had not asked for their respect, had done nothing to court their admiration. She had simply been herself, and in the crucible of the storm, that had been more than enough.